pharmaceuticals. Some industries have had really marginal returns, building materials, automotives, insurance, and some activities have had, at least in the period that Gemma was studying here, low returns, paper, steel, power. There's also a lot of variance across firms within industries, so not everything is industry level, clearly. If we look at Intel and AMD, they're very different in terms of size. They're really different in terms of profitability, right? And as a result, they're also quite different in terms of the value the market puts on them. If you look across the automakers, again, you see quite a lot of variation in size, profitability, market rates of return. I don't have Trader Joe's down here, but I do have some of your competitors down here. This graph is a couple years old now, so I don't know if it's out of date, but I studied Walmart and Carrefour quite a bit. My students have a tendency to study also Tesco and Whole Foods quite a bit. And which of those would you consider your closest competitor?
Well, I think the market would consider Whole Foods as our closest competitor.
Okay.
I mean, we deal with them for different reasons.
All right, cool. I don't suppose you're going to add the line that tells us the profitability or anything. All right, so we're going to answer these questions then. What drives competitive rivalry in our industry, and how isolated from it are we? So you could have an incredibly competitive industry, and yet your position could be a profitable one. If we look at Starbucks, for instance, look at that industry, the specialty coffee cafe industry. It's got no entry barriers, really none. You can get into that industry. You could build a kiosk for $10,000, $20,000. People are more sensitive to location probably than anything else, than to brand, menu choice. They're a little bit sensitive to quality, but if you have people sit down and define what a quality coffee is, they're wildly heterogeneous, which means there's space in the market for just about anyone, right? So far I'm describing an industry that sounds very difficult to compete in, right? Difficult to differentiate, low entry barriers, tons of competition. On the other hand, if you're Starbucks, Starbucks is a pretty attractive position in what should be a very difficult industry. It's by far the most well-known brand. It has tremendous bargaining power over a lot of its suppliers and customers. The suppliers in general in that industry don't have much power anyway, but customers presumably would have bargaining power, because you could go to any coffee shop easily. There's no switching costs. You can evaluate the quality of the good relatively easily, right? So you should have tons of bargaining power. And yet you probably still go into Starbucks and pay between $4 and $7 for a beverage that costs a few cents to make. Well, depending on how much the labor costs, right? That's a pretty attractive position. Okay. We want to understand which suppliers and buyers have the greatest bargaining power and why, what that means for us. We want to understand whether businesses outside of our industry pose a threat to our business. We want to understand the macro-environmental forces that are affecting our business, and sum all this up in the key threats and opportunities in our industry. I'm going to do that for your industries. So we're going to start with the most famous strategy model of all time. Every MBA student, every consultant knows this model by heart. They don't all use it equally well, but they certainly could identify the 5 factors, and we now often say 6 factors. So the traditional factors are degree of existing rivalry, what shapes rivalry in the industry, threat of potential entrants, what attracts them, what keeps them out, okay, barriers to entry and attraction to entry. Bargaining power suppliers coming into the industry, right? Bargaining power buyers, consumers buying from, or not necessarily consumers, could be a distributor. If you're PepsiCo, you're selling mostly into a channel. What determines their buyers? Threat of substitutes are the businesses that look like they're in a totally different industry and yet affect your industry, sometimes really profoundly. One of my favorite stories is about a company called Kufel and Esser. Do you remember Kufel and Esser? Any of you? So Kufel and Esser, let's back up in time. If you had been an architect or a banker or a mathematician or an engineer, any of those professions, or maybe just a grad student, in the late 60s or early 70s, how did you do your calculations? There were no calculators. Slide rules. You remember slide rules? Have any of you even seen a slide rule? Imagine being an engineer or an architect or a banker before calculators. So slide rules were these devices, I used one once in grade school, that slid along and they had logarithm scales and they enabled you to do complex calculations without a calculator. And Kufel and Esser was the #1 slide rule maker of all time. Beautiful mahogany slide rules. And they had such a nice glide, a powdered glide that perfectly silent and slick. If you were a prestigious engineer or banker worth your salt, you had a Kufel and Esser in your pocket, right? It was as important as having, you know, a good watch on, or today having like, you know, some sort of mobile device. You had your slide rule on you at all times. And Kufel and Esser had like between a 75% share and an 80% share of that market. #1. And then roughly 1972, the integrated circuit gets invented and the first electronic calculators come out. Total substitute, right? And there was no way for Kufel and Esser to respond, right? The capabilities that make you good at making a slide rule, just fundamentally different from the capabilities that enable you to develop efficient and effective electronic calculators. So within a couple of years, Kufel and Esser went poof, right? Just gone. So that's what you want to look for under threat of substitutes. Hopefully none of you are in that situation. That's a pretty extreme one, but important to look out for it. Yeah.
Did they try to transform their business when they saw the competitive threat? I mean, did they try to get into calculators?
They didn't, and I would say that was actually incredibly intelligent of them. Because sometimes you see organizations, I'll give you an example, Kodak, okay? And here's what I have to remind the students all the time. People see organizations almost like an animal or a person. They think of survival as being the preeminent goal. You have to survive. We want to grow, but you have to survive. Survival is so important. That's the way they view it, right? And that's the way Kodak viewed it. And certainly if you worked at Kodak, it was very rational to view it that way. But think about Kodak for a minute. Kodak was, kind of like Kufel and Esser, the most profitable and successful photography company that had ever been around, right? They had basically invented silver halide chemical photography. They made cameras and film. They had the #1 brand name in cameras and film for a very long time. And that's a nice big cash cow, right? That was a very profitable machine for them, and they grew quite large, and that's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of managers. That's a big community around your organization, right? Suppliers, customers, distributors, employees. Then digital photography starts to come out. What do you do? Chemical photography and digital photography could not be more different. And Kodak faced a choice. It had all this money and assets. There were, it had slack for a long period of time. It's been profitable. And it could either take that money and fight like hell to survive by trying to become a digital photography company, which is what it did. It took all its money and plowed it into trying to transform itself into a fundamentally different kind of company. Or it could pay that money out to its shareholders who, if they wanted to be invested in a digital photography company, could go and buy stock in state-of-the-art, efficient, and effective digital photography companies, right? Companies that were already positioned to be excellent in that space, right? So at the time, Sony, also Fuji, Canon, there was a range of other companies who were much better positioned because they were electronics companies, right? Actually, those are all part of electronic keiretsus in Japan, who had long, deep histories in electronics. They were good at it. They were cheap at it, right? Effective and productive. They had supply chains in place. They were positioned to do it, right? So now, if you're a stockholder, you probably would have been better off by Kodak practicing what we call a harvest strategy, right? Downsize, sell off assets, capture as much of the cash as you can, pay it out to the stockholders, and let them reinvest however they want to invest in whatever their next best opportunity is, which probably isn't digital photography. It's probably something else, right? But if you're a manager or an employee, or maybe someone who lives in the town where Kodak is located, your incentives are completely different. So it's interesting to think about it that way, right? Okay, now this one, Porter only started acknowledging the role of complements maybe about 8 years ago. So complements are things like video games for video game consoles, film for cameras, software for computers. In some industries, it's relatively minor. If you're Walmart, compliments might be things like good highway infrastructure near your store, or maybe a coffee shop next door that people like to come to, or maybe there's a playground outside that you drop your kids off before you come into the store. But relatively small role of compliments, readily available, they're not going to capture much of the value of your product. In some cases, compliments are slightly more important. So one thing that's really changed the landscape for Starbucks is Wi-Fi, for instance, right? The availability of Wi-Fi has transformed Starbucks, which used to be a place that you went in and either just got a coffee and left, or you went in and chatted with your friends, to now, for some people, it's their office. There are plenty of people who spend the entire day at Starbucks now in New York, which definitely changes the way their business model works. It attracts some people, but some people stay a very long time. And then, but on the whole, Starbucks has managed to capture a lot of the value from that compliment because they now offer the Wi-Fi and they make you come get your refills at regular intervals to keep the Wi-Fi access. So they've been able to manage that. And again, it's available in good quality, no problems there. Now, if you think about video game console industries, right? If you were Philips or 3DO or TurboGrafx, these are all video game console companies that most of you probably didn't hear of. We've heard of Philips, but not as a video game company, right? Or NEC. Those companies all failed because of a lack of complementary games, right? Whereas Nintendo, Sega, Microsoft, and Sony all survived, Sega not anymore, because they ensured that there were enough good, high-quality complementary games, right? So sometimes this is an extremely important factor in your industry. Okay. So, it's a lot of stuff here. If you want to do a really rigorous 5 Force analysis of your company, of your organization, there's a lot to consider. Rivalry is going to be influenced by things like if the industry is growing. If the industry is growing, it may not feel as competitive because even though you may not be getting a bigger share of the pie is getting bigger, right? On the other hand, if your industry is decreasing, it can feel really rivalrous in a hurry. Concentration, is it an oligopoly, a few big players that are paying a lot of attention to each other? Or is it fragmented? Or is it an oligopoly with a competitive fringe? That's when we say we got a couple of big firms and then we got a whole horde of smaller firms that keep us in line. How different are the competitors? If you're Starbucks and you're competing against Pete's Tea and Coffee, you're both playing by the same rules of the game, right? You know what their cost structure is, you know what their incentives are. It's pretty straightforward to figure out how they're going to behave. If you're Starbucks and you're suddenly competing against McDonald's, who's opening up McCafe and already has 15,000 locations, completely different rules of the game, right? McDonald's could make a strategic choice to not make money on its espresso beverages and make money somewhere else in its business, which could be devastating for you because you need to make money on your espresso beverages, right? So diversity of competitors can really mix things up when the competitors are fundamentally different from each other. Product differentiation. Some products are pretty easy to differentiate. I'm going to pick on you again. Trader Joe's means something to me, right? Interesting, high quality food, really good prices, right? I can get veggie bacon there for like half the price that I can get it at Morton's. And I also used to love to get the mushroom ensembles in the frozen section that you can only get at Trader Joe's, right? So low prices, interesting food, quality selection, high quality, not too many locations though, which in New York, we need more locations. Just one. We need online ordering though. Like online delivery has too.
Naomi has an idea. I can give you an exact address.
Directly above my apartment would work. On the other hand, petroleum. So in groceries, we typically used to think of groceries as not being particularly differentiated. Every retail store had basically the same mix of national brand items and then some fresh produce and some generics. What Trader Joe's did, which I found remarkable, the first time I saw Trader Joe's, it was one of the first differentiated grocery stores I'd ever been into. It was truly unique, really different. It has an incredibly loyal following. That's creating willingness to pay. Product differentiation is lowering the competition you experience in that industry. There's nobody competing directly against you, I don't think, which is a good spot to be in, I suspect. which is why you're privately held and keeping your profit numbers a secret. Now, petroleum, on the other hand, so hard to differentiate. It's a commodity product, it's basically standardized worldwide, it's subject to probably universal global standards about how you would rate it, grade it. The service you provide for it could be maybe slightly differentiated, but it's a pretty big consolidated channel, I suspect. So much tougher, it would feel very competitive. Even though you think of petroleum companies as being big, fat, profitable companies, I suspect it's also incredibly competitive. Because a lot of it's going to come down to cost, right? A lot of it's going to come down to what you can charge. Excess capacity and exit barriers become an issue when your industry, mostly when your industry is in decline. If your industry is in decline, or you have excess capacity, and it's tough to get out, things get bloody in a hurry, right? People will start doing anything to survive, to put the other guy out of business before you go out of business. And cost conditions. These are kind of related. Cost conditions, one of the big ones we think about is fixed versus variable costs. Now, if you're not an economist, or it's been a long time since you've done accounting, you may be a little uncomfortable with these terms. I like to make it really make sense to me by thinking about airlines, okay? If I'm going to fly an airplane from New York to Paris, it's going to cost about the same whether it's full or whether it's empty, right? Most of the costs are fixed in that flight. You've got there's the cost of the plane in there somewhere, but really it's the fuel and the people on it. Most of the fuel. The fuel is a huge cost, and also just that chunk of time you're using up that plane. It's a very expensive craft, and it could be doing other things if it wasn't on this flight. Now, it's all fixed costs. Where are the variable costs? How many? What?
Fuel.
Might be a little bit different in fuel if it's empty. It's mostly fixed costs of fuel. I think most of the weight is actually the plane itself. So mostly fixed costs, which means what do they do if the seats aren't sold?
Keep lowering the price.
Keep lowering, 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 and lowering to fill the plane. Because even $5 of marginal revenue is better than none if your costs are fixed, right? Whenever you have fixed costs, you're much more likely to see heavy, heavy price competition, right, if you have excess capacity. Because you paid all the costs at once. So now you're just going to lower the price, lower the price, lower the price, lower the price to increase the volume. On the other hand, think about the exact opposite. Think about, there's probably an even more extreme example, but I like to use a bagel store, right? Let's say you're a small independent bagel store, and every morning you have to go out and buy some bagels and buy some cream cheese and buy some coffee, and you come in, you open up the doors, people come in, and they come in and they get bagels and cream cheese. Well, if business declines, you buy fewer bagels, right? If business increases, you buy more bagels. There's never an incentive to drop your price below cost. Does that make sense? You would never drop maybe at the end of the day you have 5 bagels left over, maybe you sell those 5 below cost, but you're not going to sell hundreds of thousands of bagels below cost. You're just going to stop buying them. Does that make sense? So you're much more likely to see price wars when you have a lot of fixed costs. Okay, let's talk about threat of entry now. Competition, we understand now. Oh, actually, let's take a few examples. Yeah, Amit.
Yeah, I just was thinking about the second point of concentration. What do you think, how does it matter in a digital world? Because the entry barriers are so low, and you have something called, long tail. Basically, if you have any services, you